The Grand Hall of the United Nations was heavy with silence, but it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of suspicion. Netanyahu had just taken the podium, flanked by an entourage of Israeli diplomats and defense officials. He smiled, calm and composed, as if the world hadn't been watching Gaza burn for weeks. "We extend our hand in peace," he said, pausing for effect. "We seek stability in the region. But we will not be provoked. We will not apologize for defending ourselves." To many, the words sounded rehearsed. The same speech, recycled and repackaged with a fresh coat of diplomatic paint. His tone was firm, but the applause was tepid. Delegates whispered to one another. Cameras panned across faces, skeptical, cold, and some outright disgusted. And then came the shift. The camera turned to the opposite end of the chamber where Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat. He hadn't moved a muscle since Netanyahu began speaking. But now, he stood, wearing his military uniform adorned with a golden Sahelian eagle pin. Traoré's mere presence stole the air from the room. With calm precision, he walked toward the podium, not waiting for a formal invitation. The silence became a storm held in breath. He stepped up, nodded to the assembly, then turned toward Netanyahu, still seated. "You spoke of peace," Traoré began, his voice calm but heavy with fire, "but I watched the videos. We all did. Dead children, collapsed hospitals, men screaming in dust and blood. You speak of defense, while holding the match that lit the fire." The hall froze. Even the American delegation, usually quick to defend, remained silent. Traoré's words weren't diplomatic, they were a trial, spoken to the world. He reached into his folder and held up a photo, a drone image of a flattened Gaza neighborhood, time-stamped. "This was your idea of peace," he said, then turned it for all to see. "Tell me, Mr. Netanyahu, how many lives must you bury before your conscience wakes up?" Netanyahu didn't move. His expression remained frozen, but the room was no longer his. It belonged to the man who had dared to speak the truth the world had tried to ignore. Traoré placed the photo down on the podium like a weapon made of truth. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was sharp, each word a blade slicing through the polished lies that echoed in that hall year after year. "There is a sickness in this room," he said, eyes scanning the rows of diplomats. "A sickness of pretending. Pretending that the powerful do not murder. Pretending that the innocent are not buried while your committees sip champagne and issue deep concerns." He looked directly at the French ambassador, then the U.S. representative, and finally, back to Netanyahu. "You speak of peace," Traoré repeated, his voice darkening, "yet your peace comes only after the last mosque is reduced to rubble, after the last mother screams over a lifeless child, after the last bullet has passed through a journalist's vest-marked press." Netanyahu shifted in his seat, a flicker of discomfort beneath his composed exterior. But Traoré wasn't finished. He reached into his case again. This time, it wasn't a photo, it was a screen. A paused video. He tapped it. A still frame of an Israeli missile striking a UN school in Gaza. He let the silence hang. And then he pressed play. The explosion roared. Delegates jumped. Flames swallowed the screen. Screams echoed across the chamber. The footage was raw, unedited, and devastating. "This was yesterday," Traoré said, calmly. While he stood backstage, writing speeches about peace. The screen went black. But the silence it left behind was louder than the blast. Traoré turned to Netanyahu. "Do not talk to me about peace while your hands drip with ash and screams." He then addressed the chamber. "And do not pretend you didn't know. The world watches. But it's blind by choice. How long will your blindness protect him?" There was a tremor in the air now, not fear, but shame. Traoré didn't step down. He wasn't done. He had just begun to wage a war, not with bombs, but with the truth no one else dared to say out loud. The chamber felt smaller now, claustrophobic. As if the truth Traoré unleashed had pressed itself against every wall, leaving no corner untouched. Some delegates avoided his gaze, looking down at their papers, at their screens, anywhere but at the man who had just peeled away the veil. Netanyahu's aide leaned in to whisper, but Traoré raised a finger, not at them, but at the room. "Do not whisper," he said. "Speak. If you believe he is innocent, say it. Stand up. Defend him. No one moved. You cannot, Traore continued, stepping away from the podium, because deep down, you all know, this is not a war of defense. It is occupation by flame and steel. It is genocide dressed in diplomacy. A murmur rippled across the room, shocked, indignant, afraid. He turned to the representatives of nations who prided themselves on human rights. Canada, the UK, Germany, you call yourselves guardians of peace, he said. Yet when children in Gaza are buried in mass graves, your governments send more weapons, not warnings. A hand rose. The German delegate. Mr. Traore, he said, voice trembling. With respect, this is not the forum for. Traore cut him off with a glance so sharp, it silenced the chamber again. No, this is exactly the forum. You sit beneath the blue flags of peace and say nothing while bombs fall. If this is not the forum, then what is? A graveyard? He stepped toward the delegation floor. Let me ask the room, he said, voice calm but commanding. How many of you have ever stood in the rubble of a Palestinian home? How many have held a blood-soaked notebook belonging to a child who thought her story mattered? He waited. No answer. He smiled bitterly. That's what I thought. Then he turned back to Netanyahu. You do not fear Hamas, Traore said. You fear that the world is finally listening to men like me. And for a moment it was hard to tell who was more uncomfortable, the accused or those who had protected him in silence for so long. Netanyahu's fingers clenched the edge of his desk. Traore's words hadn't just pierced the silence, they had shattered a delicate illusion the West had curated for decades. Now, all eyes weren't just on him, but on the wreckage his policies left behind. He cleared his throat and attempted to reclaim the stage. President Traore, Netanyahu began, we seek peace. Israel has the right to defend itself from terror, from rockets, from tunnels, from hatred. The tone was rehearsed, the same speech, reworded 1,000 times, like a bullet polished before being fired. Traore didn't return to his seat. He remained standing, arms folded, letting the tension grow into something almost unbearable. Then, he asked one question. Is this your peace? He pulled a photo from his coat pocket and held it up. It wasn't a propaganda piece. It was a real image, raw, undeniable. A young girl, no older than 6, crushed under a collapsed school building in Rafah. Her fingers still clutched a half-burnt page from her drawing notebook, blue skies, a tree, and a flag that was now buried with her. Traore raised his voice, not to shout, but to carry the weight of truth. You speak of defense. But the bombs you drop do not distinguish between fighters and children. You've erased families, leveled hospitals, turned weddings into funerals. He turned to the assembly. And you've funded it. Delegates shifted uncomfortably. The Americans, the French, even the Saudis avoided his gaze. Cameras zoomed in on their expressions. The broadcast was live. Millions watching. Traore walked slowly across the chamber. If this is what peace looks like to you, he said, then I would rather stand with the damned than kneel with the murderers. There was no applause. Not yet, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when a man holds up a mirror to the world, and the world doesn't like what it sees. The silence in the UN chamber was no longer a pause, it was a reckoning. Even the translators hesitated, their voices trembling in earpieces as they repeated Traore's words into a dozen different languages. I would rather stand with the damned than kneel with the murderers. A sentence that now echoed across continents. Netanyahu leaned back, his face taut, as if every muscle fought to remain composed. But his knuckles betrayed him, gripping the podium so tightly his fingers went white. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Enough with the theatrics, he snapped, aiming for strength, landing somewhere between defensive and desperate. We are a democracy. We value life. We are not murderers. Traore's eyes narrowed. Then what are you when your bombs kill poets in their beds? What are you when your drones hunt children on rooftops? The room stirred again. Jordanian, Turkish, and even some Scandinavian delegates subtly nodded. The African bloc sat unified, stone-faced, unmoving. Netanyahu raised his voice, "This is war. War is not clean. We don't celebrate these casualties, but they are inevitable." Traore stepped forward, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, clarity. "You say war is not clean," he said, "but you make it a business. You package it in words like precision, defense, collateral. And while you speak, Gazan soil drinks more blood. Tell me, Mr. Netanyahu, do numbers comfort you? Do statistics justify screams?" Somewhere in the media section, a journalist whispered, "God, he's dismantling him live." The Israeli Prime Minister attempted to pivot, turning toward the Western delegates. "Are we really going to let him turn this forum into a circus? Into a trial?" Traore answered before anyone else could. "This isn't a trial," he said. "Because a trial implies a chance for justice. This," he motioned to the flags, the suits, the polished wood, "this is a stage built to pretend." Then he looked to the global audience beyond the cameras. "But today, I'm rewriting the script." And with that, the room tried to breathe again. But no one was quite sure if it still had the right to. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted. Not subtly, but violently. Not like a gust of wind, more like a detonation. A moral explosion set off by a man who refused to bow, to dilute, to speak in terms polished by diplomacy. Traore wasn't just confronting Netanyahu, he was indicting an entire system. And the world knew it. Netanyahu tried to regain footing, forcing a diplomatic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We come here for peace," he said, scanning the room as though searching for allies among the delegates, not to be humiliated by populist demagogues. Traore didn't blink. "You came here for peace?" he asked, voice razor sharp. "Then why does peace follow you only after resistance is crushed? Why do the dead speak your name in rubble?" Whispers tore through the hall like static electricity. A French diplomat leaned toward her neighbor. "He's not just attacking policy, he's attacking narrative." And it was true. Traore wasn't debating, he was dismantling the scaffolding of Western moral superiority. Netanyahu's face darkened. "This is dangerous rhetoric. It emboldens terrorists. It gives fuel to those who wish to destroy the only democracy in the Middle East." Traore stepped forward once more, hands by his sides, voice low but lethal. "You call it democracy," he said, "but only one side holds the weapons, the airspace, the borders. Only one side drops bombs. If that is democracy, then may the world remember what tyranny really means." A gasp rippled through the African and Latin American blocs. The U.S. delegation remained rigid, motionless, trapped in a conflict between old loyalties and undeniable truth. "And while you speak of democracy," Traore continued, "where are the voices of Gaza? Where are the children who never got to grow old enough to vote?" Netanyahu opened his mouth, but this time, no words came. Traore took one last step forward. "You brought your speech," he said. "I brought the ghosts." And with that, the screens behind the hall flickered, not from technical error, but from truth. A UN media technician, unknown to both leaders, had cued satellite footage of bombed schools, bloodied streets, and funerals held in silence. The room fell dead quiet. The bombs weren't in Gaza today. They were in Traore's words. For several heartbeats, no one moved. No one spoke. The United Nations General Assembly, usually a cacophony of shifting papers, whispered side talks, and guarded applause, was now paralyzed under the weight of its own complicity. Traore stood still, his figure backlit by the glow of the satellite images playing behind him. The horror was undeniable. Bombs falling on homes. Children pulled from rubble. A mother clutching her lifeless son in a white shroud. And yet, this time, it wasn't Gaza that felt the impact, it was New York. It was Geneva. It was Brussels. The audience wasn't watching a war, they were witnessing a reckoning. Netanyahu turned toward the delegation from the United Kingdom, then to the United States. But no eyes met his. The Western Bloc, always proud of its unity, now sat like porcelain figures, beautiful, hollow, breakable. Their silence screamed louder than their past speeches. Traoré's voice returned, quiet and sharp. You ask for peace, but offer none. You demand silence from the oppressed, and call it stability. You fund wars, then host summits. You kill, then call it self-defense. He pointed not at Netanyahu, but at the hall itself. The war is not just in Gaza. It is here. In this room. In every seat that looks away. In every government that sells weapons. In every leader who dares to call genocide at the conflict. At that moment, a delegate from Chile stood and clapped, once, twice, slowly. Then a representative from Kenya. Then Bolivia. Then Yemen. One by one, nations from the global south rose to their feet, until nearly half the room stood in defiance. Not against Israel alone, but against the narrative that had protected it for decades. Netanyahu's fists clenched. You are dividing this institution, he growled across the floor. No, Traoré said without raising his voice. Truth is. I'm just the echo. And then, for the first time in years, the United Nations broadcast cut to black, not for censorship, but because there were no more lies left to air. Only silence. And in that silence, Traoré had won. The broadcast had ended, but the battle was far from over. Behind the sealed oak doors of the UN's private chambers, the world's most powerful leaders now faced the man they could no longer ignore. Ibrahim Traoré stood opposite Netanyahu, not as a guest of the assembly, but as a challenger to the system it represented. The mood was tense, colder than diplomacy, sharper than protocol. Netanyahu's voice broke the silence first. That was a performance, General. But the world runs on alliances, not applause. Traoré met his gaze, unblinking. No. The world runs on blood. And you've spilled enough of it to fill the Nile. Across the room, Jake Sullivan whispered something to the Secretary of State. Macron glanced nervously toward the exit. Kristalina Georgieva tapped her pen against a folder labeled Middle East Stability Framework. But no one interrupted. Not this time. Netanyahu stepped forward, trying to assert control. Do you know what you've done, standing up there? You've turned developing nations against their trade partners. You've embarrassed your own allies. You've set fire to the diplomatic table. I didn't set the fire, Traoré replied. I just refused to eat while the table was soaked in gasoline. A Saudi delegate coughed nervously, hiding a grin behind his hand. An aide from South Africa nodded discreetly. The room was shifting, subtly, quietly, but shifting nonetheless. Netanyahu's tone darkened. You think speeches and standing ovations make you a threat? No, Traoré said calmly. But truth does. And you fear it. He walked slowly toward the conference table, where a stack of classified UN reports lay, maps of bombings, satellite photos of blockades, internal memos urging restraint in public statements. Without hesitation, Traoré pushed them across the table toward the French ambassador. Translate these into every language. Let the world read what you've buried. Netanyahu slammed his hand down. Enough. But the room didn't echo with his anger. It absorbed it, quietly, politely. Because in that moment, even his allies understood, Traoré wasn't just a general anymore. He was a storm rolling through marble halls, uninvited, undeniable, and unafraid. In the days that followed Traoré's stunning confrontation, something shifted across continents, like a quiet but certain tremor beneath the surface of global politics. While Netanyahu scrambled to contain the fallout with emergency meetings in Tel Aviv, a new alliance was taking shape, and it wasn't born in Washington, Brussels, or Riyadh. It was born in Bamako. In Khartoum. In Kigali. Behind closed doors and secure lines, African leaders began to speak words once whispered only in defiance: maybe Traore is right. The change wasn't theatrical. It was logistical. Trade agreements were paused. Aid talks were restructured. Even Ghana's finance minister refused a World Bank condition, citing regional dignity. And as for Burkina Faso, its embassies suddenly grew crowded. Envoys from Latin America, Southeast Asia, even Iceland quietly reached out. Netanyahu noticed. And he panicked. He called Macron. He called Biden. He even called MBS. "You're letting a militia man rewrite the global order," he spat through a secure channel. "He's destabilizing everything we've built." But the voices on the other end were colder now. Calculating. The same West that once mocked Traore now understood: if they dismissed him again, they'd lose the very world they claimed to lead. At the African Union emergency session, Traore stood at the center. He didn't wave a flag. He didn't wear medals. He wore silence, and behind him stood not soldiers, but leaders. Congo. Niger. Chad. Even reluctant skeptics like Kenya stood nearby. He held up a UN photo, one leaked by an anonymous aide. It showed a drone strike aftermath, the twisted metal of a children's hospital in Gaza. "This is what your silence defends," Traore said, his voice calm but sharp. "So I ask you now, not as Africans, but as humans, do we speak for the voiceless, or do we sign contracts with murderers?" The room went quiet. Not from fear, but from clarity. And as applause slowly built, one thing became undeniable. Netanyahu may have armies. But Traore had awakened a continent. The thunderous applause that shook the African Union floor didn't end in celebration, it echoed like a verdict. Traore didn't bask in it. He didn't even smile. He simply lowered the photo, handed it off to an aide, and looked at the delegation with a silence more powerful than any slogan. It was the silence of a man who knew he'd crossed a line the world had drawn, and redrawn, and dared anyone to erase him for it. From Tel Aviv to DC, the reactions were swift and predictable. Western media painted him as a fire-starter, a populist agitator risking diplomacy. Israeli spokespeople accused him of stoking regional instability. A Fox commentator went as far as calling him Africa's dangerous new cult leader. But something unexpected happened. These attacks no longer stuck. African youth, millions of them, shared Traore's speech online. In cafes from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, his words played on phones, not in anger, but in pride. Artists painted murals of his face. Students wore shirts with his quotes. Even hip-hop artists in Johannesburg dropped his name in tracks. But the most surprising support came from an unlikely place, within Israel. An Israeli journalist, Sarah Ben-Dor, broke ranks on national television. "I may not agree with his methods," she said, "but what Traore said at the AU, it was true. We are bombing hospitals. We are losing our soul." That single clip went viral globally. And for the first time, the narrative began to crack. Meanwhile, Netanyahu grew restless. He summoned his cabinet. "He's not just a man," he barked. "He's becoming a symbol. We must stop this before it grows." But how do you silence a ghost in the machine? How do you threaten someone who welcomes your threats as fuel? Traore, back in Ouagadougou, met with his military leaders and community organizers. "This isn't about a man anymore," he said. "It's about the line they crossed, and the one we must now defend." Outside, thousands waited, not for war, but for a future that finally, maybe, included them. And in the quiet of that moment, the world began to understand: Netanyahu declared war. But Traore? He had declared something far more dangerous. A future they couldn't control.